Welcome, everybody. We'll get started in just a minute. Thanks for joining us. All right, everybody, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation among 4 law school deans and co-authors about our recent joint book there in the virtual background, Beyond Imagination, and also some of our thoughts as law school deans about law school's role engaging with issues of democracy and truth and educating the next generation. I'm Jennifer Mnookin. I'm dean here at UCLA Law School, and it's really just a pleasure to be with all of you today for this jointly organized event by our 4 law schools. Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that my school, UCLA School of Law, sits on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Chankwa peoples. As members of a land-grant institution, we at UCLA pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives, past, present, and emerging. And I know that my fellow deans also would be glad to acknowledge the caretakers of the lands upon which their schools sit as well. In the wake of what happened in 2021 on January 6th, the attempted insurrection, law school deans began to talk to each other about our role and our institutional role. And as you'll hear in a little bit more detail in just a minute or two, under the real leadership of Mark Alexander, who I'll introduce momentarily, 14 law school deans came together to reflect about this, to reflect on the role of law schools, lawyers, and legal education in our exceptionally challenging times. And so it's really my great pleasure today to be with 3 of these fellow law school deans, 2 of whom are also fellow UC law school deans, and all of whom are co-authors in this volume. You can see that 3 of us have it as our background. Erwin, as most of you know, Dean Chemerinsky has extraordinary skills, but getting the virtual background wasn't among them, so he's holding the book up instead. And this book is a book of essays by each of us and will be the springboard for today's conversation about some of these issues facing the legal profession and legal education. I'm just going to very briefly introduce you to my 3 fellow deans. I encourage you to link to the digital program so you can read more about them. But please join me in welcoming Dean Mark Alexander from the Villanova University Charles Widger School of Law, Dean Erwin Chemerinsky from Berkeley Law School, and Dean Kevin Johnson from the UC Davis Law School. Thank you to my fellow deans and friends for joining us here today. I'd also like to invite audience members to put questions into the Q&A. We absolutely will have the chance to take some of those questions, and we hope that you and your questions will shape some of the conversation that we have together. I'd like to start, Mark, with you, and I'm going to go with first names. We're all deans and we're all friends, so I'm not going to stand on ceremony here. Mark, I'd love to begin with you. You really were the leader and spearheader of this project. I think it's fair to say it never would have existed but for your both your vision and your ability to herd deans, cats, pick your metaphor. Can you tell us a little bit about why you were inspired to take this on and what you were hoping for?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, and thanks for organizing this. And to me, it was a time where obviously we all had different reactions on the day, lots of individual feelings, emotions, and we had this conversation, like you mentioned, as deans, we were talking about what does this mean to us? What does this look like to us? And we collectively put together a letter that was signed by 170 of the nation's 200 law school deans immediately after January 6th. And the conversations we had around writing that letter really got me thinking, like, this is a really interesting perspective that we all can offer collectively as law school deans, but also individually as leaders in our own schools in our own fields of scholarly knowledge, and leaders generally speaking in the law. And so I thought to myself, what would happen if we all got together and did something? And I thought, is this a series of lectures? Is this a course? And then I thought, maybe this is a book. And then I reached out to the folks here and to a bunch of others and said, what do you think? And I was very pleasantly surprised. At first, I thought people would say, terrible idea, or great idea, but I can't do it. But there was such a strong outpouring of support from colleagues who said that they really want to find a way to contribute some thoughts. And so as a result, we've got 14 perspectives, and really 14 very different types of schools, different parts of the country, public, private, private religious, private non-religious, larger, smaller. So it's a really great array of perspectives. And I just told everybody, write your perspective. I didn't say that there's a theme, a thesis for this book, but it's really to have 14 essays with perspectives. And I'm just so honored that the team really came together, and that it was certainly plenty of work, but really it was a joy. And the result I'm really quite proud, and I think we all should be quite proud of.
Thanks. I'd love to next turn, we'll sort of start centering a little bit on the book and then move a little bit beyond the book itself. And so I'd love to turn next to some of these individual chapters and ask each of us to describe briefly what your chapter focused on and what you thought was the main purpose or contribution. And let's see, Kevin, can I start with you for this one?
That's great. And thanks very much, Jennifer, for putting this together. And thank you all for allowing me to participate. It's quite an honor for me. My chapter focuses, and it took me a while to get to where I ended up focusing in the chapter, because when the events of January 6th occurred, one of the first things I thought was, what kind of public statement am I going to make to the students? In the afternoon of January 6th, I was totally confused because I couldn't tell precisely what was going on, although I knew it was bad. And if I would have sent out a message on January 6th, it would have been a very dark and negative message. And I waited till the next day trying to put it into perspective. And part of my thinking was what January 6th revealed and what the entire Trump administration revealed was the importance of what we do in law schools about teaching the value of the rule of law and the value of very careful analysis of the issue, the rule, the application of the rule, and a conclusion in the traditional IGRAC method, which has its flaws and may be overly simplistic, but at least it's a rational way of approaching various issues. And that's not something that we saw in connection with the Trump administration, with the reliance on alternative facts, including the alternative fact that the 2020 election had been stolen, and a variety of other facts that used to justify policies that didn't really square with modern realities. So what I talk about in the chapter really is the importance of what we do in law schools in teaching careful legal analysis, and the reasons why we should keep doing that, and in fact, double down on it. Thank you.
Erwin, how about you?
Let me start by thanking Mark for including me in this project. And Jennifer, thank you for including me in this conversation. It's so wonderful to be with each of you. What I wanted to do in my chapter was first talk about how close the United States came to losing its democracy. The reality is, as we've seen through the world, democracies are there until they're not. No form of government lasts forever. And what's so startling about January 6th, it's the closest this country's ever come to not being a democracy. What if on that day, Vice President Mike Pence had done what President Trump urged and declared Trump to be the president of the United States? We've never before had an insurrection at the nation's capital like we did on that day. So it seems so important that we not think of that as a form of business as usual or in the realm of normal. It was so extraordinary. Of course, that's why I think this book is so important. And that's why it's so important in focusing on what we as law schools can do. Second, I wanted in my chapter to say that what occurred on January 6th is in part a reflection of, in part was caused by deep flaws in the Constitution and the law. The Electoral College was responsible for some of the problems on January 6th. No one disputes that Joe Biden won the popular vote by 7 million votes. A Senate that's organized 2 senators per state so that small states get disproportionate control is part of the problems. And I think we should be cognizant of how the Constitution was deeply flawed in these ways, and most of all in the way that it dealt with race. And third, we have to see January 6th as a result of a society that's more polarized than it's been at any time since the Civil War. And you can look at any measures of polarization, and they're higher now than they've ever been, at least in over a century or century and a half. And I think that that contributed to what occurred on January 6th. The fact that today, over a year later, 70% of registered Republican voters believe that Donald Trump won the election, even though there is absolutely no evidence to support that, shows how polarized we are. So I wanted to start with this as a premise and then try to think about what, if anything, can we in law schools do to make a difference?
Thank you. Mark, how about you? How about your chapter?
Yeah, my chapter, you know, I try to think about the way forward, and in a sense, you know, all the chapters really relate in some ways. And this sort of, in this context, I can tie it in with what Erwin was just saying. You know, we are definitely in a, you know, very challenging time, and I think what is the way forward? And so I try to draw on the Constitution, our structure of government, and my own favorite part of the Constitution in the preamble, where we talk about forming a more perfect union. And what I love about that phrase is it suggests that we are never going to be perfect, but we always strive. We are aspiring towards perfection, and that requires work. And that's why, for example, one of the ways in which the First Amendment can help us so much is that it expects us to participate, protects political speech, and really expects us to participate as we form a more perfect union. And so in that context, I say, you know, we need to engage, but we also have to engage, you know, built on certain beliefs of a commitment to truth and commitment to country. And that's something which is I think, a big challenge. And I look at sort of those constitutional aspirations. And I also look at, from my perspective as the dean at Villanova, you know, our motto is Veritas Unitas Caritas. We talk about truth, unity, and love. And I think, how do we go forward? How do we try to become what we are not yet? That's you know, a very important conversation here at Villanova. And it's aspiring, again, aspiring. We are seeking something. We are seeking something always. And it can be rooted in religion. It can be rooted in your own values, but we are all aspiring to something. And so I suggest the process has to start with us having a commitment to truth, bound by community, commitment to country, and, you know, maybe a radical concept, but commitment to loving each other as brothers and sisters, treating each other with that kind of love and respect, which I think has fallen by the wayside so much. And back to Erwin and Kevin's chapter, how do we come together? And really urging us to double down on that kind of a commitment.
Thank you, and thanks for making it so human too. I'll jump in quickly with a little bit about my own chapter. I'm an evidence scholar when I'm not a dean, and I wanted to think about questions of evidence in all of this, and really focused on the election lawsuits, the sort of period mostly prior to January 6th. And one of the things I sometimes heard, even from some of our students on occasion, was that the lawsuits were obviously erroneous and mistaken and part of the big lie, because virtually every judge shut them down and didn't let them go forward. And I do think that the lawsuits were tremendously problematic, and that the entire frame around trying to create alternative facts around an alternative election was deeply, deeply disturbing. But I don't think it's because all of the lawsuits were unsuccessful. And this is partly because my own work as an evidence scholar, I've engaged in a set of efforts that are sometimes quixotic, where I don't think we're likely to see much relief from the courts. And I don't think that the mere fact that you're bringing a suit that's unlikely to succeed should mean that you're doing something that warrants condemnation, including as a lawyer. And so I wanted to have the chance to explore what was different here. And I ended up reaching the conclusion that these suits really were different. But what was different is that there was no credible evidence. There was no plausible story to support the narrative that those bringing suits were putting forward, and that it didn't even feel like they really had the courts in mind, that it was actually about a set of a performance for entirely other audiences, and that performative dimension really was happening in bad faith and is quite dangerous, potentially dangerous to our legal system. So that was my own contribution in brief. I'd like to turn to kind of another broad question, but about sort of the effects of each of your pieces and where it goes. Erwin, you titled your piece. Let me pull it up here so I can make sure I get it right. But it was can law schools help save democracy? That's a pretty hefty potential claim there. And so I guess I want to ask you, like, can they? And if the answer is yes or maybe, how can law schools really make a difference here?
The answer has to be maybe. There's no way at this moment in time to know for sure, but I hope so. And if democracy can be saved, law schools are going to have to play a role in it. Let me try to answer your question with more specifics. One thing that I think law schools have to do is a place of teaching, encouraging, modeling civil discourse, because democracy isn't going to survive unless we have civil discourse and unless we have an exchange of ideas. Second, we need to be a place where the law of democracy is studied and taught. There are so many flaws in our electoral system. We need the expertise of law schools, the work of law students, to be able to provide a solution about it. Third, I think that law schools have a real responsibility with regard to civic education outside of our own students. I worry that part of the problem that led to January 6th is the dismal job we do with regard to civic education. And I think all of our law schools have a responsibility to reach out, whether it's to junior high school and high school students, or to Lions clubs and Rotary clubs, or any place else where we can help teach people about the Constitution. And I think if we can do just those things, we can help save democracy. But I also have lots of other ideas of things we need to do.
Thank you. Mark, I'm going to come back to you because your chapter kind of engages with similar themes about a path forward. You began to describe that in your earlier comments, but I guess I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about what you think that path forward could look like, and also anything that might make you uneasy about it or not confident that we can succeed.
Yeah, it's not easy, and I think that what I try to do, and this is I think one of the perspectives I had hoped for from all of the deans, is I try to think about what I can do in my community. We have about 550 students roaming the building who will be lawyers. And I think, can I tell them and show them this way forward? And so I make a point to tell the students just what I was saying earlier about how we need to treat each other. And I tell them that's expected of them with anybody who is in the building or who comes to talk. It could be a guest or it could be somebody who is a student or a professor, that there are ways in which we need to show how we conduct ourselves. And so I think part of the path forward is, like I say, start with your local community. For me, like, let's say this 550 students, but then I think, how does that go onto a campus where we've got about 11, 12,000 people on the campus? How does that extend into the Pennsylvania Bar? I tell this to people at the Pennsylvania Bar Association. I tell them local judges. So I think it's honestly something which has to start very locally, because it's very hard. And I think that kind of, most local kind of contact is going to be necessary, because we are so polarized in the big picture. You need to talk to folks and say, you know what, I bet there's something we can talk about. And you'd be surprised, because there are things. You saw President Biden last night. We are certainly in challenging times, but there were a lot of times where he said things and everybody stood up in the chamber, right? Let's just say, what can we do about those things? we might have to wait a few minutes to take on the next thing, but let's find something that we agree on and let's actually do something about it. So I think it's starting local and starting with a commitment of that kind of, really commitment to country, to community, and to treating each other with a kind of respect and dignity that everyone deserves.
Thank you. Kevin, I'm going to ask you a version of the same question. You also thought a little bit about where law schools should really go in the wake of January 6th. How should this moment in time, I don't want to focus just on what happened in January 6th, but the polarization, the election challenges, the incredible gap in perspectives, the claims where people seem just not even to be able to see where other people are coming from. What should this mean for you as the dean of a law school, and where law school should go?
I think it's important to keep in mind that January 6th, and you're suggesting this, is part of a larger set of issues. And one of the issues at the core of it was race. This was an insurrection led by white supremacists using racial epithets and attacking police and others. And I think this is an important historical moment for law schools and the nation, really, to start coming to grips with the systemic racism in the United States. One of the best things about the Trump presidency is he's put such a fine point on all of these things and made it clear that race was at work in so many policies and approaches. He referred to the Blacks and threatened the Blacks who were protesting police brutality of Blacks with violence. He referred to Salvadorans and Haitians as coming from S-hole countries. He referred to Mexicans as criminals and rapists in announcing his successful 2020 campaign. And I think that this is an ideal time to think, and our students are pushing us to do this, to think about how to integrate race and systemic racism in our law schools, and are pushing for more critical race theory, various requirements for graduation. And I think that we should think hard about how we can satisfy those goals and to address some of these issues. In some ways, it's an ideal moment. And again, it's in part because President Trump, 5 years ago, critical race theory may have been well known among academics and law professors. President Trump, by criticizing it, in using Dr. King's language in criticizing it, has made it a local staple at school board meetings across the country, attacking critical race theory, attacking the leftist propaganda agenda, barring diversity training and any teaching of critical race theory in governmental programs. So I think this is an ideal opportunity for us to recognize the embedded racism in so many of our systems, from voting to education, to the criminal justice system, to the immigration system, and to have full and fair discussions before we can kind of start addressing these issues. And sometimes I'm a little surprised by how much teaching we need to do, how some people's knowledge of basic American history is not as full as perhaps it should be. And so I think our work is cut out for us, but I think students are pushing us, society is pushing us in a direction where we can start addressing these issues and shouldn't hide behind the fact that they're complicated, difficult, and are going to be hard to solve.
I just would build on that just for 1 second, if I may. I think that what's interesting is that Donald Trump was obviously extraordinarily successful in his political career, what may still be going on, but he was elected president of the United States. Very few people have achieved that. And he tapped into something he tapped into people and their worries. And I think what he was successful at was a politics of division. There's different ways to succeed in politics, but he so often said it's somebody else's fault. And, like one thing I mentioned in my chapter, for instance, is how we attack the press. He said, these are the enemy of the people. And so there's lots of division. And I think that's one of our challenges. And sort of what you were asking about before, Jennifer, also what's uneasy. you know what I think is uneasy is it's a very powerful force. When people are unhappy in some ways, they're looking for some reason, and they can say, can we come together? Or are we going to just like go to our own separate camps? And I think that's the unease, is that are people going to embrace that concept that we actually can treat each other as brothers and sisters? Or are we going to say it's this person's fault? It's the fault of this person who stole your job, or this person who came across the border and wanted to hurt you, or this person. That blame, that was very successful as a politics, a method. But what are we going to do as a country? And how do we say, look, I'm not going to blame you. I'm going to find the common humanity with you. And it's just very hard to do. That's the uneasy part, but I think Kevin's comments made me think about that.
No, thank you. That's powerful. Thanks to both of you. I'm going to go back and forth between my own questions and some of the questions that we're getting in the chat. So please feel free to keep those coming. There's several of them that are really about consequences for lawyers who participate in some of these activities. And those, since we are 4 law school deans, one of them is a former law school dean, Chapman Law School Dean, John Eastman, and obviously quite a number of other prominent lawyers, including lawyers from, very elite law schools in this country, played significant roles. What do we do with that as deans of law schools? How do we engage with that, challenge that problem with where is the line between zealous advocacy and misconduct? And how do we talk about that, and how do we teach it, and how does it look different? Erwin, maybe I can start with you for this one.
Sure. I think there is a hard question there that you point to. What's the line between what's zealous advocacy and what's plotting a coup? I'm one of the people who signed the letter urging the California State Bar to investigate John Eastman and discipline John Eastman. And because I believe he crossed that line and was plotting a coup. I know John well. He and I did a weekly radio program together for 15 years. He and I did dozens of appearances on panels together. I will no longer appear on a panel or a program with him because I don't want to legitimize him. If you read the memo that he wrote that outlines how Mike Pence could throw the election to Donald Trump, that isn't within zealous advocacy. That really is plotting a coup. And to me, that's the line that then warrants bar discipline.
Thank you. Any comments, Kevin or Mark, on, it doesn't have to be on Eastman in particular, but on consequences for lawyers who cross these lines and how we define that?
Yeah, I guess just building on that, it's our obligations, our responsibilities, our oath as lawyers, and that is to the Constitution and the rule of law. And when there is an attempt to subvert the rule of law, when there is, somebody who is defending, again, without a factual basis, a violent attempt to overthrow the proper functioning of the government, I think then we have to say that's an attack on the system that we are sworn to uphold. That's not, do you like being a Democrat or Republican? It's not about partisanship. It's about loyalty to country, Constitution, and law. And that's what we have. It's an amazing responsibility to be a lawyer. I'm very proud of being a lawyer, but I think that does call on something more, and that's a commitment to the system itself, not to undermining the system.
I do think the line can be hazy at times between zealous advocacy and lawlessness. I think, and I've appeared with John Eastman a number of times on immigration panels, and I think his approaches to various areas of law, in my view, were consistently lawless. On birthright citizenship under the 14th Amendment, for example. And so I find it troubling, more troubling than him taking this position of representing government, the fact that he found an audience at the highest levels of government that this might be the kind of thing they want to hear and they would pursue. That's troubling, but I leave it to the state bar to figure out the ethics of it all, because I certainly don't know all the details. But I do want to say, in my mind, it appears he crossed that line, but in many instances, I find the line hard to decipher. And I'll give you an example, a case I worked on that it was a tough one. It had to do with whether an undocumented immigrant could be licensed to practice law in California. It was before the California Supreme Court. And there's, it wasn't horrible law, but it wasn't good law. And in the end, we prevailed. So, it was good, but it was a close one.
Yeah, I mean, this raises a really, I think, hard issue for us as educators, especially in polarized periods, because on the one hand, we do want to be able to say that there are times when people and the choices that they've made have crossed that line, right? And really are not acceptable to the profession. I mean, whether it's criminal conduct or not, it's unprofessional conduct, and that there should be consequences. At the same time, we actually want to encourage the kind of cross dialogue that Mark's been describing, and not be super quick to view those with whom we disagree as having crossed that absolute line of not warranting being a conversational partner or somebody with whom to engage in dialogue. And we all four of us, I think, believe both of those things, right? We believe that we're in a moment where sometimes people are too quick to only deem those with whom they agree as worth engagement, and yet that it's also incredibly important to have those lines. So I will open this up to any of you who'd like to comment, because I think it's a really important issue as we train and work with and learn from the next generation of lawyers.
I agree with you that it's an enormously important issue, and I think you put the question very well. But to me, the answer comes from January 6th was different. January 6th was an attempted an insurrection. And to focus on someone like John Eastman, he was on the platform on the Capitol Mall on January 6th. He wrote the memo outlining how there could be an effective coup. And I think if we just put that in the realm of, well, there's arguments on both sides, we trivialize what occurred on January 6th. It wasn't in the realm of normal. Now, of course, we should still discuss this. I would hope in all of our professional responsibility classes, in each of our law schools, they talk about whether or not bar discipline is appropriate for John Eastman or Rudy Giuliani. But as deans, I think there's times that we have to speak out for the rule of law. And the response to January 6th to me is one of them.
Thank you. It's, I mean, I think all four of us would agree with that too. But I think Kevin's contribution was really valuable to also remind us that there can be a murkiness around, when we take 3 steps away from that, at where we draw those lines and how we talk and think about it. So anybody else want to comment? I mean, Kevin, you already did, but if you want to add anything, please feel free.
I do think it's one thing to say a Supreme Court decision should be overruled, Plessy versus Ferguson, as opposed to concoct some fictional legal theory justifying a coup, in effect.
Right.
But that requires candor and honesty at some level too.
Mark, this book was partly inspired after an effort of a much larger group of deans to say something jointly.
Right.
Do you want to say anything further about the relationship there, or what was sayable and what wasn't sayable in a group of, however many we were, 170? I can't remember. Exactly.
Yeah. It was the conversation we had as deans was interesting because we all have our own personal opinions, but we are the leaders of our institutions. And that puts us in a place where we need to speak out for our institutions, certainly, but also, again, these larger principles of the rule of law, the commitment to the ethical practice. There's been plenty of talk about what do we do with the lawyers. There's actually a great chapter. Andy Perlman from Suffolk has a chapter on specifically on these questions. And so what was interesting is getting us to think about our roles, where we are always careful. We have to be careful about where we go, where we step. And sometimes we have to stay out of things where we might feel passionately, but it's just not something where we want to talk as the dean of the law school. But sometimes we feel like we need to step in. And what was fascinating to me was how strongly and clearly we, again, it was like 85% of law school deans of the country very quickly came to consensus, which, by the way,
that never happens.
Never happens, because we each have a little tweak. I want to use the word may, and Jennifer wants to say shall, and then Kevin wants to say should, and Erwin wants to say, you can imagine getting law school deans to agree on things. That's not even counting, again, the difference of schools we've got. So I was so fascinated that I feel like it was a coming together where we collectively saw that there was something we needed to do, and we did so in our letter. And that really inspired me to think, you know what, I really believe that we collectively would like to keep speaking. And that collective voice, I think, is very important. I think it is important that, I am in Pennsylvania and you're in California. I am a member of the California Bar, but I'm here on the East Coast, and that we've got deans in Minnesota and in Florida and all over the country. Geographically, we are very different types of people. And that's because I think we have a collective voice, which is getting to maybe these sometimes fuzzy lines, but the lines where we're saying, what's our commitment to the rule of law, our commitment to the Constitution, the commitment to our system of government.
Thank you. I think it's that these challenging times have actually led law school leaders and deans to be more connected to one another. I actually think our community, the ties have thickened, and the collaborative engagements and the forms of mutual support have grown. I think that, we've long had, Kevin's been dean longest of any of us on this call. So Kevin, you can really talk about this with greater history, but there's a shared dean's email list, but for often it wasn't really active. But in these difficult times, there really has been more of an effort to connect and learn from each other and collaborate. And I certainly feel that with, I'm lucky to be on this panel with two fellow UC deans, and who are the other two UC deans who contributed to this project. And I'm grateful for the intensified collaborative impulses. So maybe that's a starting place for some good things. I'm not sure. Let's come back to some of the questions that we're getting in the chat. We have several that are about the elections that are coming up, right? Obviously, there were enormous efforts to claim falsely election fraud in our presidential election. We've seen some elections since then, and we've got midterms coming up. How do we think about the problems of election integrity, especially also as various efforts to make voting more difficult are well underway in a variety of locations. Several different questions I'm kind of merging there that we've gotten from our audience. Who'd like to take that up?
Let me, I jump in for a second. I mean, first, part of my perspective is I am an election law scholar, again, like you, when I get the chance to write and teach. And so we have seen a lot of, there's such interesting case law and election law, and talks about things like the registration rules and voter suppression and gerrymandering. And I think what's important is that what we're seeing now, what I'm concerned with is to Erwin's previous point, this is different. There's always been certain things that have happened, but this is something where I think of the example of Arizona and I'm forgetting what they call them, the voting cyber ninjas or something like that. These are folks who decided they were just going to challenge the entire process. The process itself had run, the people voted in Arizona, they did a double check, they did a double check, and turns out that, the people voted as they did, and the Electoral College moved forward with those votes. Months later, somebody said, oh, well, we're going to challenge that. Well, that's a problem, because that's extra legal. That's extra constitutional. That's outside of our system. So I think that's what is, I think one thing that's important to recognize is there are things which are within what our system defines, but there are things which are coming from outside, which are saying fundamentally, I'm not going to abide by the election. Mm-hmm. That's a problem. I think it's important for us to note. And with Erwin's pointing out from the beginning, we have a flawed Constitution. We all look, I know how I counted in the original Constitution. That wasn't too good for me, but I can tell you all the flaws, but it is a system we have. And, you know, if we have nothing to replace it with, and I think it is not to be forgotten when we look at what's happening today in Ukraine, we have some folks who do not believe in the kind of system we have. And that is not impossible. And so we have to remember that we have a system, and going outside of it is very dangerous.
Thank you, Mark. Kevin or Erwin, either of you want to jump in?
I'm enormously worried. Let me point to three things. One is the systematic efforts to disenfranchise minority voters. In the last year, 18 states have adopted laws to make voting more difficult, all of which clearly are going to have a disparate adverse effect on minority voters. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court has facilitated this. It's gutted the Voting Rights Act. One key part of the Voting Rights Act was to require jurisdictions with a history of race discrimination to get pre-clearance, pre-approval before changes. The Supreme Court declared those provisions unconstitutional in 2013. The other part of the Voting Rights Act was to say that if state and local governments have election systems with a discriminatory effect against minority voters, it violates the law. But the Supreme Court last July in Brnovich versus Democratic Committee very much weakened those provisions. And so I think it's going to be very hard to challenge these laws that clearly have both the purpose and the effect of disenfranchising minority voters. Second, I'm really worried about the ways in which political control over elections increased. One of the things that Republicans have tried to do after the 2020 election was to allow more political control over election officials, giving legislators and legislatures greater ability to change the outcome of the election, making election officials more politically accountable. And I worry what that's going to mean in close elections in 2022 or 2024. And finally, there hasn't been the effort that we need to reform the Electoral Count Act. It's the Electoral Count Act that specifies what's supposed to go on in counting votes in Congress. It was adopted in 1887. It does have ambiguities. I would have thought after January 6th, there'd be a bipartisan effort in Congress to revise the Electoral Count Act to not leave any possibility of a vice president throwing the election, as almost happened on January 6th. But so far, that reform hasn't happened. So all of this comes together to make me very worried about what's going to happen in November or November 2024.
I share many of those worries. And I think that, there's a very complex war going on, voter suppression, then a challenge to the fairness of the elections, the claim, for example, that millions of illegal aliens are voting and taking elections. I also think that we have to look even beyond the electoral process to see how there's been an attempt to influence the system. And for example, the citizenship question that the Department of Commerce wanted to add to the 2020 census was all designed for apportionment and minimizing Democratic voting power and Latino voting power. Once pressed, the Trump administration couldn't offer a non-laughable defense for the decision to include that question in the end. But I think vigilance is all important, and it's not just the electoral system. It's well beyond that, and it's going to require a lot of attention. And this, I fear, is going to be a continuing battle, especially as some states shift in terms of population, like Arizona, in some other states, and there's a fear that Republican power will be lost.
Thank you. Lots of sobering but important thoughts from each of you. Some of the people listening in today and who've been asking questions are not yet in law school, but are applying this year or planning on going. And they're thinking about the ways that being a lawyer may give you particularly privileged ways to make a difference, or the opportunity to engage in some of these fights for the things that we most value, our democracy, our values, racial justice, whatever might be motivating a would-be law student. We've just heard some pretty sobering thoughts about the next couple of years and elections to come. What would each of you like to say to those thinking about law school, or those who've decided to go to law school but are wrestling with the complexity of all that they're hearing and the obstacles to a more perfect union and greater justice?
I mean, I would say first, I'm just so glad that you are here if you're currently watching, and to those who you may speak to, and yourself, I say, go to law school. This is great. We have the opportunity to do something. If you see that if you are concerned about where our country is going, regardless of your politics, if you're concerned with where we're going as a country, this is a great way to get something done. You can engage as a lawyer in ways that are really remarkable. We all can participate individually in politics, but lawyers have an outsized power and responsibility in our system. And so I think that one great step to take is go to law school. Learn more about the system, learn about how you can affect change, whatever the changes you want. But law school gives you a set of tools. It helps your thinking, and it gives you a license to practice law that gives you the opportunity to really help make change, to really help move your community, however you want to define it, your town, your school board. You could be working with nonprofits, with for-profits, whatever, but it gives you the chance to really make a difference. So go to law school.
Mark said it so well. Let me try to apply it to what we're talking about now. Courts are the ultimate guardrail of democracy. And the guardrails held with regard to the 2020 election, I think it's striking that there were a couple of dozen lawsuits, maybe even more than that, filed challenging the outcome in particular states of the election. And every judge, state and federal, Democrat and Republican, all found that there was no evidence of fraud, and all upheld the popular vote in those states and the electoral votes based on that. Now, in each of those cases, the result was because there were lawyers there to present to the judge the evidence that there was no basis for concluding fraud. And the judges and the lawyers did the right thing. The democracy wouldn't have survived January 6th if it wasn't for the lawyers and the judges. And so I agree with Mark. I believe that law is the most powerful tool for social change. And if the rule of law survives in this country, it'll be because of lawyers.
Thanks, Erwin.
I agree with all of that. It strikes me that a law degree and being a lawyer makes it possible to affect social change in a great variety of ways. It can be from being an activist to being a political leader, to being a lawyer defending somebody in a criminal lawsuit, to a lawyer helping the poor. And you can get amazing experiences nowadays in clinical programs to give you an idea of what the difference is a lawyer can make. In our family protection clinic, for example, a law student under the supervision of an attorney can get a temporary restraining order stopping a woman for being beaten by an abuser in an afternoon, can change that person's life. A student in an immigration clinic can get an asylum seeker from China relief and change that person and that family's life. And I think that there's amazing range of opportunities with a law degree, depending on how you want to use it. And if you go in the private sector, and that's what I did, I became familiar with people did pro bono work and started representing Central American asylum seekers and developed an interest in immigration law, which is not a class that was on my law school's curriculum when I was in law school. So the options and opportunities are great. And I do think that, to me, one of the wonders of being a lawyer is just the different options that are available that you don't have to decide about on day one.
Yeah,
I think that's all. You've all said this so well and so powerfully. I do think we need to acknowledge that lawyers have been part of the solution, if there is one, but they've also been part of the problems, right? And so this is the sort of the yin yang, or the frustrating balance of justice. I mean, if we tell the story of the of either the checkered history of our country or these recent events, lawyers both have the opportunity to do everything that you've all described, but they also have the opportunity not to. And so I just, in contrast to your former, depressing descriptions of the state of electoral law, you were so cheery about the power of lawyers that I do think it's just important that we reflect on that, as we've done earlier in this panel, including around John Eastman and beyond.
Right. But I think that's our big challenge as deans, is that we need to impress upon our students this direction that they're going and the obligation that comes with it. And you're absolutely right. You know, you can find lawyers in lots of different places, but I think that it's important for us to make sure we impress upon the students, this is an awesome responsibility and awesome opportunity. So do something with it that's for some greater good. We can't control what they do once they leave our doors, but I think when they're here, you know, we tell them, you know, be aware of what you can do. And that, again, that's not to say they have to do a particular job, but just understand they've got the power to do something, and that they just should make sure they're doing something that makes something for the greater good.
A couple of lightning rods here coming from the lightning rounds coming from the questions. For each of you, if you could get rid of the Electoral College and just have the president be elected through popular vote, yes or no? And if you want a sentence or two on why. Okay, Erwin.
Unquestionably, yes. A democracy should be about majority rule. It shouldn't be that the minority gets to choose the president. Also, if you look at the history of the Electoral College, it was very much tied to the institution of slavery.
Thank you. Kevin or Mark, anything to add?
Well, put slightly more pointedly, the Electoral College is built on racist foundations to maintain white supremacy and deserves to be dismantled.
Mark?
And yeah, and everywhere else in our Constitution, we talk about having, you know, maintaining this democracy, but it's this one weird exception, and it doesn't fit.
Right. Okay. Any chance that, and I would agree. I'm right there with the three of you. Any chance that will occur in
No.
anytime soon?
I say no.
It would take a constitutional amendment that would require approval of 3/4 of the states. And too many states benefit greatly from the Electoral College that they would ever pass such a constitutional amendment.
That's Erwin's eloquent version of my simple no.
Right. Kevin, any other thoughts on that? It's fine if you.
I think Erwin's right.
So let me ask each of you if you could advocate for a change in our electoral practices or policies that you think is imaginable, what would that look like, right? I mean, we've just had an interesting moment where all of us thought there was a change that we think would be a good thing, but we think is simply unrealistic, at least for now. What would you change?
I would change the role of money in politics, fundamentally making it clear that money creates a disproportionate power. The role of it creates a disproportionate power for those with wealth and access to it. And that it violates our principles of equality.
I agree. I would change the Voting Rights Act. I would overcome the Supreme Court's tragic decisions in Shelby County and Brnovich that gutted the law, that almost got through Congress, but for a Republican filibuster. And as I said earlier, I would certainly change the Electoral Count Act with regard to counting presidential votes in Congress.
I would allow lawful permanent residents to vote in state and local elections. I'd also allow them to serve on juries. And in fact, the California legislature a few years ago passed a law that Jerry Brown vetoed as, quote, un-American, that would have allowed lawful permanent residents to serve on juries.
Great, thank you. So I love that we've been able to have a conversation that at least touches upon both probably unreachable hopes for change, as well as some that might be more imaginable, if still challenging. I'm hoping we have time for 2 more questions from our attendees. We've got a couple of people asking, do you think there's a place to prosecute a former president? And some people are asking it generically, and some people are asking it with a particularity that I think you can imagine. Anybody want to jump in on that one?
The president can be prosecuted for, offenses that he commits. Nobody is above the law, and and things which are not in pursuit of his act, particularly, don't give him any kind of immunity. So, I think the answer is it is possible.
I agree with that. I also changed my mind over time. Initially, I thought that prosecuting Donald Trump would be too divisive for the country. Now I believe that not prosecuting Donald Trump sends the message that nothing was done that was untoward, nothing was done that was illegal. And what was done was illegal and it was untoward. I think unless we prosecute, we don't send that message.
I'd be interested in what precise crimes the indictment would be on in thinking about it. I am, as you probably can tell, I'm not a fan of the policies and approach of the former president. But I think it's a serious matter to engage in criminal prosecutions and have to look carefully at whatever was drawn up.
Yeah, I would associate myself with your answer, Kevin. I don't think anybody should be above the law, but I also think that we need to be careful, and the details matter. But certainly I could see a world where that is what we would need to do here. One last question. With the positive momentum of this collaboration among law school deans, what should the next book be about? Mark, can you bear to work with all of us again? What do you think?
I would love to. I would love for somebody else to take the lead. It was honestly, it was a highlight of my professional life. And I believe that each of our chapters could be the beginning of an entire book by each of us. So, it could just be volume 2. There's just so much more to say, just building on what we've said.
Well, I think that's a good place for us to end, and it's exactly 4 o'clock. Huge thanks to my fellow deans for joining me today, and in particular to Mark Alexander for spearheading this project and bringing it.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.